The day I became the most hated woman in Willowbrook Estates was the day I finally learned how much power I'd been sitting on for 23 years. Margaret Thornfield, our HOA president, slapped me with a $200 fine for fishing at 5:30 in the morning. Apparently, I was disturbing the peace and violating quiet hours. What she didn't know was that her precious little kingdom was about to crumble, and I held the keys to its destruction in my tackle box all along. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA president who thinks they run a dictatorship instead of a neighborhood, drop a comment below and let me know your worst story. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one, because what I did to Margaret makes every other HOA revenge story look like child's play. Let me paint you a picture of who I am, because understanding my background is crucial to appreciating just how spectacularly Margaret underestimated me. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a 52-year-old civil engineer who moved to Willowbrook Estates in 1999 with my late husband, David. We bought our house on Lakeshore Drive not just for the stunning water views, but because David was an avid fisherman, and the private lake was exactly what we dreamed of for our retirement years. David passed away 3 years ago from cancer, and fishing became my way of connecting with his memory. Every morning at dawn, I'd walk down to our private dock with his old tackle box, cast my line into the still water, and feel like he was sitting right there beside me. The lake wasn't just a body of water to me, it was sacred ground, the place where David taught our daughter Emma how to bait a hook, where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings in comfortable silence, where his ashes were scattered according to his final wishes. Our house sits on what I later learned was a very special piece of property. When Willowbrook Estates was developed in the late 1990s, the builder needed access to the back section of the development where the lake was located. The problem was geography. There was only one practical route to reach the lake area, and it required building a road across the corner of what would become my lot. David, being the detail-oriented accountant he was, negotiated what's called an easement agreement. Essentially, the developer paid us a substantial sum and granted us a permanent easement that gave us, and only us, legal ownership and control over the 20-foot wide strip of land that the lake access road was built on. At the time, it seemed like a win-win situation. We got paid for the minor inconvenience, the development got their lake access, and everyone was happy. The legal documents were filed with the county, and David kept copies in his meticulous filing system. I'll be honest, after he died, I barely thought about those papers gathering dust in his office. They seemed like ancient history, just another piece of bureaucratic paperwork from a lifetime ago. The neighborhood had been peaceful for over 2 decades. Most of the original residents were like us, middle-aged professionals who wanted a quiet community with lake privileges. We had a small, reasonable HOA that handled basic maintenance and collected modest dues for landscaping and snow removal. Then, about 5 years ago, Margaret Thornfield moved in. Margaret was in her early 60s, recently divorced, and apparently had nothing better to do than make everyone else's life miserable. She immediately ran for the HOA board and won, largely because most people couldn't be bothered to show up to the elections. Within 6 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the president position and began what I can only describe as a reign of terror. Margaret stood about 5'4" with perfectly coiffed silver hair that never seemed to move, even in a windstorm. She wore her authority like an expensive perfume, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. Her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes, and she had this habit of tilting her head slightly when she spoke to you, as if she was addressing a particularly slow child. Under Margaret's leadership, our HOA dues tripled. Suddenly, we had new rules about everything: what color your mailbox could be, how many decorative flags you could display, what time you could put your garbage cans out. She instituted property inspections and began issuing fines for violations that no one had ever heard of before. The woman turned our peaceful neighborhood into a surveillance state, and she seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding reasons to penalize people. Margaret's favorite targets were what she called non-conforming behaviors. She fined the Johnsons for having a vegetable garden that was supposedly unsightly. She wrote up Mrs. Peterson for hanging laundry on a line instead of using a dryer. She even issued a violation to the Martinez family for their children's bicycles being visible in their own driveway. But for some reason, Margaret seemed to have a special hatred reserved just for me. Maybe it was because I was a widow living alone in one of the larger lakefront houses. Maybe it was because I didn't attend her monthly community improvement meetings, where she basically lectured everyone about property values and neighborhood standards. Or maybe it was because when she tried to engage me in neighborhood gossip, I gave her polite but firm responses that made it clear I wasn't interested in her drama. The first real confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in early June. I was returning from my usual dawn fishing trip, carrying my rod and David's old tackle box, when I saw Margaret standing at the edge of my driveway with her clipboard and her phone. She informed me that several neighbors had complained about my excessive early morning activity that was disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of their properties. According to Margaret, the HOA quiet hours were from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., and my fishing activities were in clear violation of community standards. She handed me a formal notice of violation and announced that I had 7 days to cease the behavior or face escalating fines. I tried to explain that fishing was a quiet activity, that I wasn't making noise or disturbing anyone, and that the lake was supposed to be available for all residents to enjoy. Margaret's response was to tap her clipboard with her pen and remind me that HOA rules applied to everyone equally, and that early morning recreation was simply not acceptable in a community that prioritized peace and property values. The fine was $200, due within 30 days, and Margaret made it clear that future violations would result in increasingly severe penalties. She suggested that if I wanted to fish, I should consider joining a public fishing club that operated during appropriate hours. I paid the first fine, hoping that would be the end of it. I even tried adjusting my schedule, waiting until 7 a.m. to head to the lake. But Margaret wasn't satisfied. She began patrolling the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV, and somehow she always managed to spot me heading to or from the lake. 2 weeks later, another fine. This time, she claimed I was loitering by the water for extended periods, which created an intimidating presence for other residents who might want to use the lake area. The absurdity of the accusation was breathtaking. I was sitting quietly on my own dock, fishing in solitude, bothering absolutely no one. But Margaret had photographs, timestamps, and a new violation notice. The third fine came with a threat of legal action. Margaret informed me that the HOA was prepared to pursue all available remedies to ensure compliance with community standards. She mentioned that continued violations could result in liens against my property and potential forced sale to recover unpaid fines and legal fees. That evening, I sat in David's office, staring at the stack of violation notices and feeling more defeated than I had since his funeral. This wasn't just about money or fishing. Margaret was systematically trying to drive me out of the home I'd shared with my husband for over 20 years. She was attacking the one activity that kept me connected to his memory, and she was doing it with a smile on her face and bureaucratic language that made her cruelty sound reasonable. I called Emma that night, and she could hear the exhaustion in my voice. She offered to help with the fines, to hire a lawyer, to come stay with me for a few weeks. But I realized that paying Margaret's extortion fees or running away wasn't going to solve the problem. Someone needed to stand up to her, and if not me, then who? The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in early July. I decided to stick to the 7 a.m. rule, even though it meant fishing in the heat instead of the cool, peaceful dawn hours that David and I had always preferred. I was sitting on the dock, having caught nothing but enjoying the quiet meditation of casting and reeling, when I heard footsteps behind me. Margaret appeared with 2 people I didn't recognize, a man with an expensive camera and a woman with an official-looking folder. Margaret announced that she was documenting my continued harassment of the community, and that these witnesses were here to observe my aggressive behavior toward other residents. I hadn't seen another resident all morning. I'd been sitting quietly by myself, lost in memories of David teaching Emma how to tie fishing knots on this very dock. But Margaret began staging a performance, speaking loudly about feeling threatened and unsafe due to my territorial behavior around the lake area. The breaking point wasn't Margaret's theatrics or her fake witnesses. It was when she looked directly at me and said, "This is exactly the kind of selfish, antisocial behavior that drags down property values and ruins communities. Some people just don't belong in neighborhoods like this." In that moment, I realized Margaret wasn't just targeting my fishing. She was targeting my right to exist in this community. She was trying to erase not just me, but the memory of David and the life we'd built here. And suddenly, something clicked in my mind, a memory of David explaining easement law during one of his meticulous reviews of our property documents. That afternoon, I went into David's office and pulled out the filing cabinet he'd organized with his typical precision. It took me about an hour to find the folder labeled Property Documents, Willowbrook, but when I opened it, everything became crystal clear. There, in black and white legal language, was the easement agreement that David had negotiated 23 years earlier. But it wasn't just an easement allowing road access across our property. David, being the thorough negotiator he was, had structured it as a conditional access easement with termination rights. The language was complex, but the meaning was simple. We owned the land that the lake access road was built on. The HOA and all lakefront residents had been granted permission to use that road, but only as long as certain conditions were met. Those conditions included peaceful enjoyment of adjacent properties and compliance with original community standards. More importantly, the agreement gave us the unilateral right to terminate the easement with 90 days written notice for any violation of the Peaceful Enjoyment Clause. In other words, if the HOA or its residents engaged in harassment or behavior that disrupted our quiet enjoyment of our property, we could legally shut down the only road that provided access to the back half of the neighborhood. I read the document 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Then I called my lawyer, Janet Morrison, who had handled David's estate. Janet confirmed what I'd hoped. The easement agreement was rock solid, properly filed, and absolutely enforceable. Margaret's harassment campaign wasn't just violating basic human decency, it was giving me legal grounds to cut off lake access for the entire back section of Willowbrook Estates. But Janet also explained the nuclear nature of this option. Blocking the lake road would trap 12 families in a dead-end situation with no access to their properties except through a narrow walking path through the woods. Property values for those homes would plummet overnight. Some families might be forced to sell at massive losses. It was the kind of action that would make me powerful enemies and turn me into a neighborhood pariah. I told Janet I needed time to think about it, but honestly, my mind was already made up. Margaret had declared war on my right to exist peacefully in my own home. She'd turned my grief ritual into a community crime and my lake access into a weapon for her control games. If she wanted to play hardball with people's homes and happiness, she was about to learn what real power looked like. My first step was to gather intelligence. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly documenting Margaret's harassment campaign against other residents. I talked to Mrs. Peterson about her laundry violation, learned about the Johnson's garden fine, and discovered that the Martinez family had been cited 3 times for excessive child noise during normal daytime hours. What I found was a pattern of targeted harassment against anyone who didn't conform to Margaret's vision of suburban perfection. She wasn't just a control freak, she was systematically using HOA rules to force out residents she deemed undesirable. The woman was running an ethnic and economic cleansing campaign disguised as community improvement. I also researched Margaret's background and discovered some interesting information. She was living on a fixed income from her divorce settlement, and her lakefront house was the most expensive thing she owned. If property values in Willowbrook dropped significantly, she'd be financially devastated. Her entire retirement security was tied up in a house that was only valuable because of its lake access. Armed with this knowledge, I began phase 1 of my plan. Instead of paying my latest fine, I hired Janet to draft a formal legal response. The letter challenged the validity of Margaret's harassment fines and cited specific violations of my rights under both HOA bylaws and state harassment statutes. More importantly, Janet's letter included a subtle but unmistakable reference to our family's property rights and easement interests in the community, and mentioned that continued harassment might force us to reconsider our voluntary cooperation with neighborhood access arrangements. To most people, this language would sound like standard legal bluffing. But to anyone who understood property law, it was a polite way of saying, "Back off, or I'll shut down your road." Margaret's response was exactly what I expected. Instead of de-escalating, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting and announced that my legal intimidation tactics were proof that I was a troublemaker who needed to be removed from the community. She proposed increasing my fines to $500 per violation and suggested pursuing a lawsuit to force the sale of my property. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community center, and about 30 residents showed up. Margaret stood at the front with her PowerPoint presentation about maintaining community standards and dealing with problem residents. She had photographs of me fishing, timestamps of my violations, and a detailed plan for escalating enforcement actions. But Margaret made a crucial mistake. In her presentation, she specifically named me and displayed pictures of my house, my dock, and me personally. She called me a disruptive influence and suggested that my antisocial behavior was evidence that I didn't belong in Willowbrook Estates. Several residents looked uncomfortable with Margaret's personal attack, but no one spoke up. The vote to increase my fines passed 22-8, and Margaret announced that enforcement would begin immediately. She looked directly at me during the vote count with that same smug smile she'd worn while issuing my first fine. That was the moment I decided Margaret needed to learn about consequences. The next morning, I called Janet and authorized her to begin drafting the easement termination notice. Under the terms of our original agreement, I needed to provide 90 days written notice before cutting off road access. The clock started ticking the moment that certified letter was delivered to the HOA's registered address. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. Instead, I began phase 2 of my plan, building alliances with the residents who would be affected by Margaret's harassment campaign. I started with Mrs. Peterson, who had been fined for hanging laundry. She was a 78-year-old widow on a fixed income, and Margaret's $100 fine was a significant financial hardship for her. I offered to pay her fine and suggested that Margaret's behavior might constitute harassment under state elder abuse statutes. Next were the Johnsons, whose vegetable garden had been deemed unsightly. They were a young couple trying to save money and eat healthy food, and Margaret's demand that they replace their tomatoes with ornamental shrubs was both expensive and ridiculous. I helped them research HOA bylaws and discovered that Margaret's garden prohibition wasn't actually supported by any written rule. The Martinez family was my third target. Their children had been cited for excessive noise while playing in their own backyard during normal daylight hours. As the mother of a grown daughter, I knew exactly how infuriating it must be to have someone criminalize your kids for being kids. One by one, I built relationships with Margaret's other victims. I didn't reveal my plan, but I did help them understand that they had rights, that Margaret's interpretations of HOA rules were often legally questionable, and that organized resistance might be more effective than individual compliance. Meanwhile, I continued my morning fishing routine, now with a small digital camera to document any harassment. Margaret obliged by showing up at least twice a week with her clipboard and phone, issuing new fines and making increasingly ridiculous claims about my disruptive behavior. The photography was important because Janet was building a harassment case that would support our easement termination claim. Every documented incident of Margaret turning my peaceful fishing into a confrontation strengthened our legal position. 6 weeks into the 90-day notice period, I decided it was time for Margaret to understand what was coming. I scheduled a private meeting with her, ostensibly to discuss resolving our ongoing conflict. We met at a local coffee shop, and Margaret arrived with her typical condescending confidence. She brought a folder full of my violations and what she called a compliance plan that would allow me to remain in the community if I agreed to fish only between noon and 2 p.m. on weekdays, and only after giving 24 hours written notice to the HOA office. I listened to her entire proposal with a straight face, taking notes and nodding occasionally. When she finished, I thanked her for her time and said I needed to discuss her offer with my legal counsel. Then I stood up to leave. But as I reached the door, I turned back and said, "Margaret, I'm curious about something. How much do you think your house is worth?" She looked puzzled and answered that it had been appraised at $800,000 when she bought it 5 years earlier, and comparable sales suggested it was now worth closer to $900,000. I smiled and said, "That's interesting. I wonder what it would be worth if the lake access road was permanently closed." The color drained from Margaret's face, but I walked out before she could respond. I wanted her to spend the weekend thinking about what I might have meant. Margaret's retaliation was swift and predictable. The following Monday, I received notice of a $500 fine for intimidation and threats against HOA leadership. She claimed that my comment about the road was evidence of a conspiracy to damage community property values and demanded immediate payment plus a written apology. That fine was Margaret's final mistake. Janet immediately filed a response pointing out that discussing property values wasn't intimidation and that Margaret's retaliation actually strengthened our harassment case. More importantly, Margaret's own fine notice provided written evidence that she understood the potential impact of road closure on community property values. With 30 days left in the easement termination notice period, I finally revealed my hand. Janet sent a comprehensive letter to every property owner in Willowbrook Estates, explaining the situation and providing copies of all relevant documents. The letter detailed the original easement agreement that gave my family control over the lake access road. It documented Margaret's 3-month harassment campaign against me and several other residents. It included photographs, timestamps, and legal analysis of Margaret's violations of both HOA bylaws and state harassment statutes. Most importantly, the letter explained that Margaret's behavior had triggered the peaceful enjoyment violation clause in our easement agreement, and that the road would be permanently closed in 30 days unless the harassment stopped immediately. The community response was immediate and dramatic. My phone started ringing within hours of the letter's delivery. Some residents were angry and accused me of holding the neighborhood hostage, but many others were supportive, particularly the families who had been targeted by Margaret's enforcement campaigns. An emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and this time, nearly every resident showed up. The community center was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Margaret tried to control the meeting, but the room was in chaos. Residents were shouting questions about the road closure, demanding to see the easement documents, and arguing about whether Margaret's actions had created the crisis. Mrs. Peterson stood up and described Margaret's harassment of elderly residents. The Johnsons talked about being fined for growing food in their own backyard. The Martinez family detailed the citations against their children for normal childhood play. But the most devastating testimony came from Robert Chen, no relation to me despite the shared surname. Robert was a real estate attorney who lived in the back section near the lake, and he'd spent the week researching the legal implications of my easement termination. Robert explained that road closure would indeed make the back section properties nearly inaccessible, that property values would drop by at least 60% overnight, and that some residents might face foreclosure if they couldn't make mortgage payments on suddenly worthless homes. He also confirmed that my family's easement agreement was legally bulletproof, that Margaret's harassment campaign clearly violated the peaceful enjoyment clause, and that I had every right to terminate access if the violations continued. The room fell silent when Robert finished speaking. Everyone understood that this wasn't just about fishing fines anymore. Margaret's power games had put the entire back section of the neighborhood at risk of financial devastation. Margaret tried to regain control by proposing a compromise. She suggested that I could fish without restrictions if I agreed to pay all outstanding fines and formally apologize for threatening the community. She claimed this would satisfy both parties and prevent the road closure. I stood up and looked around the room at my neighbors, some supportive, some hostile, but all of them finally understanding the consequences of enabling a bully. Then I looked directly at Margaret and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I told the room that this had never been about fishing or fines or HOA rules. It was about a pattern of harassment and intimidation that Margaret had used to control and punish anyone who didn't conform to her personal vision of community standards. I explained that paying her extortion fees and apologizing for being victimized would just encourage her to target the next person who didn't fit her ideal. But I also acknowledged that innocent families would suffer if the road was closed. So I proposed my own compromise. Margaret could resign from all HOA positions, the harassment fines against me and other residents would be rescinded, and the community would adopt new bylaws preventing this kind of abuse in the future. If those conditions were met within the remaining 30 days, I would withdraw the easement termination and allow normal road access to continue. Margaret's response was exactly what I expected. She accused me of extortion, claimed that I was trying to destroy the community out of spite, and insisted that she was the victim of a coordinated attack by problem residents who didn't want to follow reasonable rules. But the room had turned against her. Resident after resident stood up to describe Margaret's harassment, her unreasonable interpretations of HOA rules, and her targeting of families who didn't conform to her standards. People who had been afraid to speak up individually found their voices as part of a group. The vote was called at 10:30 that evening. Margaret's resignation was approved by a margin of 41-7. The harassment fines were rescinded unanimously, and the community voted to adopt new bylaws that would prevent any single person from wielding the kind of arbitrary power that Margaret had abused. Margaret stormed out of the meeting, shouting that she would sue me, the HOA, and anyone who supported my illegal intimidation tactics. But everyone in that room knew she had no case. Janet had structured everything to be completely legal, and Margaret's own behavior had created the justification for every action I'd taken. The following Monday, I called Janet and authorized her to withdraw the easement termination notice. The Lake Road would remain open, but Margaret's reign of terror was over. Margaret put her house on the market 2 weeks later. The asking price was $850,000, which was probably realistic given the damage her behavior had done to the community's reputation. But even in a seller's market, lakefront properties in neighborhoods known for HOA drama don't attract premium buyers. The house sold 4 months later for $720,000, which probably left Margaret with just enough profit to buy something smaller in a community where she couldn't terrorize her neighbors. Meanwhile, I returned to my morning fishing routine. The lake was peaceful again, and I could sit on David's dock with his tackle box and feel his presence in the quiet dawn hours we'd always shared. The new HOA president was Robert Chen, the real estate attorney who'd explained the legal situation to the community. Under his leadership, we adopted reasonable rules, transparent procedures, and a formal complaint process that prevented any future Margaret-style harassment campaigns. Property values in Willowbrook actually increased over the following year, partly because buyers valued the community's reputation for standing up to bullies and protecting residents' rights. I never regretted using the nuclear option against Margaret. Sometimes bullies only understand consequences, and sometimes the only way to stop a tyrant is to show them exactly how much power they don't actually have. The tackle box sits on my kitchen counter now, ready for tomorrow morning's fishing trip. David would have been proud of how I handled Margaret, but he probably would have figured out the easement angle weeks before I did. He always was better at seeing the big picture while I got caught up in the details. Looking back, I realized that Margaret made the classic mistake of assuming that quiet people are weak people. She saw a grieving widow who just wanted to fish in peace, and she thought that made me an easy target for her power games. What she didn't understand was that sometimes quiet people are quiet because they're confident. They don't need to make noise or throw their weight around because they know exactly what they're capable of when pushed too far. Margaret learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it too late to save herself. If you've ever had to deal with an HOA bully or a neighbor who thought they could push you around, let me know in the comments how you handled it. And if you enjoyed watching Margaret get exactly what she deserved, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about karma catching up with people who abuse their power. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's showing someone that they never had the power they thought they did in the first place.